Namo Namah. Om. Hung. So, when I was a child, I loved poetry, and one of my most treasured belongings was a very old, battered poetry book. And on the first page, there was an ink drawing of a sort of shining land, and underneath it said some lines from Wordsworth, which were, "The earth and every common sight to me did seem apparelled in celestial light." I was only about nine then, but those words spoke to me so deeply because they expressed my own feeling for the beauty of the world. My sadhana, the visualization practice I took up when I was ordained, was Green Tara, and she's always been associated, somehow quite mysteriously with nature. So she's a female figure. She represents an aspect of the enlightened mind, and what she symbolises is active compassion. She has her right hand stretched out in a gesture of infinite giving, and with her right foot she steps down into the world to go to the aid of living beings. And there's a very beautiful story of another Buddhist figure, Avalokiteshvara, who weeps for the suffering of the world, and from the lake of tears that Avalokiteshvara weeps, Tara arises. Shortly after I was ordained 2 years ago, I went to visit Bhante, our teacher, Urgyen Sahajatara, along with my good friend Apeksha Devi. Those of you who've been to see Bhante will know that communication takes place, almost regardless of what you might say. But at one point I said, "Oh, Bhante, so you did the Green Tara practice. Do you have any tips?" And Bhante said, "Do it every day." And then he thought for a moment and he said that one could reflect on nature, and that nature is green. So then we got on to the subject of the Green Party, and anyone who knows me will know that given half a chance I will get onto the subject of the Green Party. So it wasn't that long after Caroline's election as the first Green MP, and I said to Bhante that what concerns me most is climate change and the scale of suffering that will be involved with that. And the gist of the conversation that we had was that even though all things are impermanent, it's still worth trying to do something to prevent suffering. And after that, Bhante said, "Oh, perhaps you could invite Caroline Lucas to come and speak at the Buddhist Centre." So here we are. So I'm going to speak about climate change. And I realise it's not going to be that easy to hear, and it's not easy to say. Most of you will know that I have a 6-year-old son, Francis, so none of this is abstract theory for me, it's all very much heartfelt. So as Buddhists, we talk a lot about interconnectedness. Nothing exists in isolation. Everything arises in dependence on conditions and ceases when those conditions cease. So a really simple example, a rainbow. A rainbow appears to be a separately existing phenomena. You see it in the sky, there it is, but it's arisen in dependence on conditions. So in dependence on sun and rain, you get a rainbow. But it's actually more complex than that, because I'm having to sort of break things down in order to sort of name them, sun, rainbow, etc. But for the purposes of now, let's say in dependence on sun and rain, a rainbow arises. And when those conditions change, the sun goes behind a cloud, the rain stops, the rainbow disappears. And the same is true of all conditioned things, from our mental states to our solar system. And the conditions that made life on Earth possible have not occurred anywhere else in our solar system. And the conditions that sustain life on our planet are being altered dramatically by human activity. Specifically, the burning of fossil fuels, leading to what we call global warming or climate change. As more heat's trapped, the sea ice melts, less heat's reflected back into space, and eventually, if it hasn't done so already, this process will become self-sustaining, or what we refer to as runaway climate change. In Alaska, the permafrost is melting, releasing methane, a far more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Sea levels are rising, and the rate of that rise is accelerating. More than 20% of Arctic sea ice is gone already, and in recent years we've witnessed the highest average temperatures in recorded history. So the UN estimates that by the middle of this century there may be 150 million environmental refugees at any given time. Refugees from climate change, 150 million. And it can be hard to see what the fruits of our actions are, both positively and negatively. Vajralila once said to me that it's a bit like an apple tree. If you think about an apple tree, the apple's the fruit of the tree, but the apple doesn't look anything like the tree. So increased flooding in Bangladesh may not look like the fruits of our actions in the West, but it is. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, in 2007, using various different climate models, came up with some projections for the rise in global surface temperature this century. Their lowest case scenario, which was based on us as a society managing to dramatically reduce our CO2 output, was a rise of between 1.1 degrees Celsius and 2.9 degrees Celsius. The highest case scenario gives temperatures of between 2.4 Celsius and 6.4. But global emissions for recent years have been higher than even the worst case trajectory. And currently we're heading for a rise of 4 degrees plus. Okay? So it used to be said that in order to avoid runaway climate change, we needed to stay below 2 degrees. But recent analysis has shown that this is in no way a safe limit, and that even a 1.5 degree rise looks pretty nasty. And as I've said, we're already heading for a 4 degree plus rise. A rise of 1 degree will bring about the collapse of the Great Barrier Reef. Even if we stopped producing CO2 tomorrow, we're still committed to a rise of at least 1.4 degrees plus because of the CO2 we've already released. A 3 degree rise will bring about the complete collapse of the Amazon ecosystem and the very real threat of conflict over water around the world. So there's even more to this, I'm afraid. I'm going to say something now about peak oil. So peak oil, what is peak oil? Well, very simply, it's the point in global oil production where we've used up about half of our oil supplies. Oil is a substance that was laid down in our oceans 90 to 150 million years ago. It's a finite resource, and our modern world is completely dependent on it. So the peak is when we've used up half of our oil supplies. Production has peaked, and after that it begins to decline. So the majority of estimates place this peak as being between 2010 and 2015, with very few credible researchers placing their forecasts beyond 2020. Once the peak's reached, the gap between supply and demand begins to steadily widen, and it will become an increasingly expensive commodity. Already, oil companies are resorting to more and more desperate measures to reach hard-to-get-at oil, for example, the tar sands. And this is set to greatly accelerate the process of climate change. But the crux of the matter is food production. So, up until about 1800 or so, there was about 1 billion people on the earth. Now, the second billion, post-industrial revolution, took only 130 years, 1930. The third billion was reached just 30 years later, 1960. and currently there's about 6 billion people on the planet. We now produce food on a massive scale using fossil fuels in the form of fertilizers, pesticides, hydrocarbon-fueled irrigation systems. It's refrigerated, stored and transported by sea, air and road. And all this we do with fossil fuels. I would say that without localization of food production, and soon, society as we know it will collapse. There's a lot I could say about this, but I haven't got time. I'd just like to recommend the Transition Handbook, From Oil Dependency to Local Resilience. It's basically about the power of community, and Lewis is a transition town. Brighton doesn't currently have a transition initiative. There's a couple of groups that I'm sort of hoping might be on the verge of becoming them, but I've been looking into myself, to be honest. I've started looking into myself with the idea of starting something myself. So if there's anyone with a serious interest in this, I'd love to hear from you. So where does politics fit into all this? I'm sorry to have to speak so plainly, but the government we have now, they're not going to do anything about climate change. Here's a couple of quotes that I like. On the issue of climate change and the environment, the political system has failed us. It's not first and foremost a crisis of technology. It isn't even a crisis of public opinion. If you ask people, do you want solar power? Do you want energy efficiency? The answers come back overwhelmingly, yes, we do. But the bridge across the chasm of public opinion to public policy that's called government, that bridge has fallen into disrepair. So here's another quote. The reality is that we have very responsive political leaders. They're just responsive to wealth and corporate power. People say, why aren't politicians responding to the global crisis? Because they're responding to a higher power. And right now, that higher power is the fossil fuel industry. So what's different about the Green Party? Well, I've been involved with the Green Party for 4.5 or 5 years now. I've done a lot of leafleting, a fair bit of canvassing, and I'd say quite a lot of consciousness raising. I did used to carry this bag around with me everywhere. Caroline Lucas, MEP. Thinking of it as publicity. And then until one day I got a bit of a reality check of seeing myself as sort of harassed mum on the bus with my autistic child screaming on the floor of the bus because he couldn't get the seat he wanted with this sort of skanky looking bag that had obviously been washed at low temperatures with sort of eco cleaners. I've stopped using it. But my experience of people in the Green Party, and councillors particularly, is that people have a heartfelt desire for a fairer world. And I believe the party has the skills to make that a reality. So my vision is of a green government. And I'd like you all to consider helping to make that happen. I did about 3 hours leafleting the other day. Admittedly, it was quite hard to find 3 hours when it wasn't raining or I didn't have Francis. But I covered 6 streets. You know, imagine how many streets we could cover, all of us together, if we all did 3 hours. I'd like you to think about it. You could come along to the Engaged Buddhism group that we have here. Next month, Mokshini and myself and Julia and my friend Kat, we're going to be doing a green energy event, an energy event. We're going to be trying to encourage as many people as possible from our Sangha and our interfaith contacts to switch to a green energy supplier. So our Kupa writes in his book Touching the Earth that we need to come to a place of accepting that there's more suffering in the world than we can hope to address in any imaginable timescale, but that we shouldn't let that daunt us from making a start. Gukyapati and Maitrasara suggest that we should do each act for its own sake, because it's an expression of truth, of generosity, of love, of fearlessness. Actions have consequences, and non-action has consequences. And to my mind, this is not a time for non-action. I recently read in Positive News that at a gathering of 1,500 members of the Quakers in the UK, an official commitment was made to become a low-carbon sustainable community. A participant said, "There was a call for us to move beyond our comfort zone and be prepared to make uncomfortable changes in response to the enormity of the challenges we face." So, is this something we could do? I'm going to give the last word to the Lord of the Rings. Frodo. "I can't do this, Sam." Sam. "I know, it's all wrong. By rights we shouldn't even be here, but we are. It's like in the great stories, the ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were. Sometimes you didn't want to know the end, because how could the world go back to being how it was after so much bad had happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come, and when the sun shines, it will shine out the clearer. Those were the stories that stayed with you, that meant something to you, even if you were too small to understand why. But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. Folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. They kept going, because they were holding on to something." Frodo. "What are we holding on to, Sam?" Sam. "That there's some good in this world, and it's worth fighting for."
What I thought I would do was say just a little bit about how I got involved in green politics and what it means for me, and then perhaps how that relates back to some of the enormous challenges that we've just heard about. So I joined the party back in 1986, which is quite a long time ago, and I just read a book by Jonathan Porritt called Seeing Green, and if anybody fancies looking at it, I think it still really stands the test of time, actually, which is a good thing and a bad thing in the sense that things are not much better and haven't changed in terms of being more positive, really, than he wrote about in 86. But that it had a real kind of clarity. And what I loved about it was that it was bringing together really the different aspects of my life at the time. I was very involved in the anti-nuclear movement. I was also involved in women's movement and doing a bit on environmental issues at that time. And I felt I was being pulled in so many different directions, on any given day, do I go to the anti-nuclear movement or the women's group or the whatever, and it was just getting too difficult to juggle the diary, frankly. So then suddenly what Seeing Green did was to bring it all together in one kind of analysis and show the links between the way we treat each other and the way we treat the planet, and that same mindset that thinks that nuclear weapons could possibly be justified is the same kind of mindset perhaps that is able to exploit the planet to the point of potential extinction and treat people that live on the other side of the world as if they had absolutely no humanity. Otherwise, how could we possibly live in the way that we do, in a sense? And so to see the connections that I found in that book, in Seeing Green, really made me realize that all of these different areas that I was being pulled were actually deeply connected, and that within the broader green political framework, you could find responses and potential solutions and ways to address all of them at the same time. And so it meant that I didn't have to go to so many meetings. That was wonderful. I could just go to the Green Party meeting instead of 10 other meetings, so that was good. And for me, it really was that moment, sometimes how you read a book or you hear someone speak or a thought comes to you and you just know your life's changed. And it felt like that for me when I finished that book, Seeing Green. And I was living in Clapham at the time in a really grotty bedsit, and I was doing some research at the British Library. And as I closed the book, I noticed that it said that the Green Party office was based in the Clapham High Road, so I thought, this is just meant to be, this is just perfect. So I marched out of my bedsit and up and down Clapham High Road looking for what I fondly imagined would be a large building with a plaque on the wall saying Green Party. And I couldn't find it anywhere until eventually I found a kind of broom cupboard behind a Chinese restaurant, and that was the Green Party office. And so I signed up there and then and got very involved. I was their press officer between 87 and 89. I was a councillor in Oxfordshire between 93 and 97. The European elections came along in '99, and that was the first time when we had proportional representation. And so I was elected to the European Parliament in '99 until I stood down in 2010 when, thanks to the efforts of everybody here, I was able to win the seat of Brighton Pavilion. And for me, what I was saying earlier about bringing together the different aspects of my own life and concerns, I suppose what still means most to me about green politics is that it really does make the linkages between social justice, environmental justice and peace. And those are the kind of bits of the equation that seem to be most important to me. And I think with social justice, I was going to start with that, partly to be a bit counterintuitive, because I'm sure you all thought I'd start with environment. And to me, social justice and environmental justice are so linked in so many ways, not least from the perspective of thinking that if we're concerned about environmental impacts, then the people that suffer most from them, most directly, are indeed the poorest people. And so right from the start, you're starting from a perspective of looking at differential impacts and how some of the worst impacts of our production and consumption patterns tend to hit people on the poorest incomes hardest. And so I think the Green Party has a particular understanding about equality and social justice. And part of that is all of what you would imagine. So it is about promoting not just a minimum wage, but a living wage. It is about opposing the privatization of public services. It is about, talking about genuinely progressive taxation. I mean, I love the fact that Francois Hollande is now talking about a tax of 75% on people who earn over £1 million. That isn't actually formal Green Party policy yet, but it will be if I have anything to do with it. I think ours is we talk about a 50% tax on salaries over 100,000. But I mean, it's genuinely about that fairness agenda that you would imagine, and challenging the fact that in the last few years, the top 100 CEOs, chief executives, have seen their salaries increase by about 49%, while the rest of people, are absolutely struggling, as you know only too well. But I think as well as being very, very serious about that social justice agenda, it is also about going further and talking about equality, not just in terms of people here and now in this country and between people in the West and people in the South, but it's also, and much more challengingly, if you like, about people who are alive now and people who are yet to be born. Because if we're serious about the phrase that people often talk about, in other words, that we don't kind of inherit the earth, we don't own it, we just hold it in trust for future generations, then I think that sense of, well, what are we passing on to future generations is a massively challenging and important one. And just as you said, that for you this isn't an academic thing with your son Francis, it's a very real thing. I also have 2 kids, and for me this became a much more real thing when you think about your kids and their kids, and what kind of planet are we genuinely passing down. And I've got a little quote I scribbled down here from Edmund Burke, actually, a rather unlikely source, but 200 years ago he said, "Society is a partnership not only between those now living, but between those living, those dead, and those yet to be born." And more recently, Mrs. Brundtland, who did the Brundtland Report in 1987, one of the really key environmental texts, back in '87, she wrote, "We act as we do because we can get away with it. Future generations don't vote. They have no political or financial power, and they cannot challenge our decisions." And that's very true. And I think obviously one of the challenges to think about how we bring in that perspective into the day-to-day decision-making that happens now. And the time that I've had at Westminster, if it's taught me anything, is that it's just reinforced what you all know, which is that it is completely unfit for purpose. That, thinking beyond the next 5 minutes or 5 months is challenge enough. With a few focus groups, Parliament and government might think for the next 5 years, but they're certainly not thinking about the next 50 years or the next 100 years or 500 years. And so I think one of the real challenges of the Green Agenda is to try to work out what mechanisms do we put in place to try to make sure that those voices of people as yet unborn are somehow heard and factored into some of the decision making that we're doing now. And maybe what's unique about the Green Party too is we would say that about future generations. I think most of us would also say that in some way about other species as well. I think that we have more of an ecocentric point of view than being purely anthropocentric. I mean, we do talk in our manifesto very strongly about animal rights, and I think that our policy on animal rights is a very strong one. And I think that is a recognition that we are just one bit of a web, and trying to get away from that old-fashioned idea that humans are at the top of the hierarchy, and therefore anything below us is there simply to serve us. I think it's important to talk about intrinsic value, and I think it's important to talk about morality, even though that's perhaps a loaded word. But one of the things I worry about a little bit is that in the decision making that happens now, we put everything into economic terms, and even as environmentalists we do that too, or I do that too. I should perhaps only own what I do, I don't know what you do, but I know that, for example, if I have 30 seconds on the Today programme to make the case against nuclear power and a new nuclear power station at Hinkley, I am more likely to say that yes, it's unsafe, and yes, it's unnecessary, but also it's massively uneconomic. And I use the economic argument because I think that will be most effective in a 30-second soundbite to try to say to government and to people of power that actually, even in their own terms, economically speaking, nuclear power is a very bad thing. But am I ceding, by doing that, too much ground to them? Did that then take us much more onto the economic grounds and the dangers of that? Because some things can't have price tags on them. We don't know the cost of the last tree before it gets cut down. We don't know, you know, the tipping point for climate change. We're not sure which last act it will be and what cost you would put on that, the doing of it, whether it's a new airport or if it's a new road system or whatever it is. So trying to put prices on everything is very seductive in one way, but it does lead us into some quite dangerous ground on another way. And so I was kind of challenging myself, what would I feel about going on to the Today programme and saying to John Humphreys, well, no, I'm against it because it's immoral. And maybe that's more powerful. I don't know. It's an open question that we could discuss. But I think we do need to get some of that language back. Otherwise, we cede too much of the ground to the other side. So future generations, how we get the voice at the table. And there are different mechanisms, actually, that some countries have tried looking at, and they're all quite cumbersome. But, for example, in Hungary, which in many respects is not, right now at least, a model of any kind of good politics, but they did, under the previous administration, set up what they called an ombudsperson for future generations. And this person has a seat at the cabinet table and has a role of scrutinising all policy as it comes through the government, and can screen that against a set of criteria, trying to imagine impacts in 50 years and 500 times, and has some power of veto if they think that would be overstepping what is compatible with that kind of perspective. And that will be one way of doing it. But it seems to me that the short-termism of our current system, our current political system, is so... The word that came to mind was deadly, and actually, I think it's probably quite an accurate word in this context. It really is. If we're only ever looking at chunks of 5 years at a time, then we really have some big problems. And that takes me on a little bit to some of the environmental justice issues, I guess, in the sense that my biggest worry is that we're running out of time, and that's what I love about Buddhism, actually. It stops me panicking about this quite so much, because maybe we can talk about that later too, but I loved your bit of poetry. That was beautiful. And I was trying to think, what's the piece of poetry that I keep coming back to? And actually mine's from Andrew Marvell, who was a metaphysical poet from the 16-something or others. And it's not nearly as relaxing as yours, because mine runs, and at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. And I say that to myself about 10 times a day. I'm probably quite pathologically insane, really. But that sense of we're running out of time is something that I feel really, really strongly. And when you hear the scientists who are telling us, as you heard, that tackling climate change, we don't have forever to get it right. You know, the next 5 to 10 years, literally, specifically, and absolutely, could make the difference between whether or not we do trigger those tipping points that we heard about, or whether or not we have some chance of getting off the collision course we're currently on with climate catastrophe. And when you really internalise that, if you really think, actually, because of the cumulative impact of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that's what makes action in the next 5 to 10 years so important. It's not enough to think, well, we'll carry on as we are for another 5 or 10 years, and then we'll make more dramatic action in 15 or 20 years. It doesn't work like that. By that time, the extra impact of the emissions that will already have collected in the atmosphere will be that much more difficult to address. That these so-called tipping points, this runaway climate change, is much more likely to happen. It's much more likely that we will then get to that point where the sea ice has melted, and therefore the sea is absorbing the sunlight instead of reflecting it, and therefore, you know, you start to see the peat bogs beginning to melt and give off the methane, and then it's really, really into difficult times. And so that sense that kind of the next 5 to 10 years is critical is both an absolutely sort of terrifying responsibility, but it's also, if you turn it around the other way, an awesome opportunity. You know, I think anybody living today, you know, we can't be saying, well, we don't know what's the big issue of our day? There's no big issues of our day. We have some pretty big issues here. And the thing that I just spend a lot of time thinking about is how do we mobilize the political will and the public momentum to act fast enough? Because if it was the case that just writing ever more dramatic leaflets in very small type and handing them out was going to be enough, then we'd be home and dry. We've done an awful lot of that. But we know that actually terrifying the life out of people is not the best way of motivating behaviour change, that actually painting a more positive picture of what the world could be like is far more likely to lead to the kind of change that we need to see. I don't know if any of you saw the film The Age of Stupid, but it was a film based on the idea of some kind of climate catastrophe, and it features Pete Postlethwaite, who is the sole survivor of some kind of climate catastrophe, and it features him in 2050, looking back to today now, and going through a whole load of real news footage, so genuine news footage that's been either in the UK or the US or Asia or wherever. And when you see it like that, because of course one never sees year after year of selective newsreel, but when you see it like that and all of this stuff basically talking about the hottest summers, the wettest summers, the biggest forest fires, all of the kind of evidence of a climate changing. And there he is, the sole survivor in 2050, looking back to today, and he says in words that still make the hairs go up on the back of my neck, why is it, knowing what we knew then, we didn't act when we still had time? And that to me is just simply the most compelling question. What is it? It's not that we don't know, it's not that we can't afford it, it's not even that we don't want it. So what is it that is stopping us making the changes that need to be made in order to get us off this kind of collision course we're on? Is there that sense of this wonderful species that we are, and yet we're in danger of spending all of our time monitoring our own extinction rather than taking active steps to avoid it? And there are a lot of answers to that question, and partly it's a very natural human response to be in denial about very unpleasant things, and so that's part of it. There are very powerful vested interests who don't want us to believe it, and we know what the oil companies are doing when they fund these so-called climate institutes, which spent their whole time pumping out misinformation very, very successfully in the US and sadly increasingly effectively in this country too. But it's also perhaps that we've allowed ourselves to be seduced by some of the language about how advertisers and everybody else around us would like to see us, that we are customers, not citizens. One of the things that annoys me most is when people talk about me as a customer. I am not, first and foremost, a customer. From time to time, I may be a customer, but I am a citizen and I'm a person and a human being, and that means that I have a whole set of interests and concerns that are much more than just the price of a good to be bought in a shop. And if I could recommend a book to you as well, I would recommend Tim Jackson's book called Prosperity Without Growth. And this is a book about how we can be prosperous in its broadest sense, not richest, but having the strongest quality of life in a way that doesn't depend on endless economic growth. Because what is clear is that our current models of production and consumption are simply incompatible with any sense of getting off this collision course that we're on with climate change. And that means that we do need to make efficiencies, and we do need technology change, we do need renewable energies, and all of those things, for sure we need all of them. But for those people that think that if we just do things a bit more efficiently, then we can carry on as we are, I would just point to the population figures that we heard about that are going to be increasing massively. The fact that people who are coming into the world and the people who are getting richer in countries like China and India, they are absolutely legitimate in expecting to have higher, what they would think of as a better quality of life, but essentially a better standard of living than. Of course, it's legitimate for them to aspire to that when they've been kept in poverty for decades, for centuries. But if they are allowed and enabled, as they should be, they have the right to have the growth that they need in order to develop, just so that they're not in extreme poverty. How much more of a responsibility is there upon us to be able to reduce our consumption in order to leave the environmental space, if you like, for them? And yes, that efficiency will be part of it, and yes, technology transfer will be part of it, but behaviour change has got to be a critical part of it as well. And that's where I think we do come up against some of the challenges, because it's much easier to think that we'll just choose a more efficient widget rather than thinking, well, maybe this is a widget we'll do without. I mean, that's, there's lots of stuff about green consumerism, and if you're consuming, for sure, green consumer is better than brown consumerism, but there aren't very many campaigns out there. There are a few. There is a no shopping day, but there aren't very many campaigns out there saying, well, hang on, why are we on this treadmill of thinking that more and more stuff is going to make us more happy? And there's all that lovely wealth of information from the New Economics Foundation that show us what we all know, which is that beyond a certain level of meeting our needs, then more and more growth and more stuff and more GDP doesn't make us happier. You know, according to a whole set of indicators, actually it can make us, you know, the kind of life that you lead in order to get the more wealth can actually lead to greater social breakdown, greater unfairness, inequality, crime, addictions, and so forth. And there are lots of lovely graphs from New Economics and elsewhere that will show that GDP has doubled in the last 30 years, but our sense of our own well-being and our happiness certainly hasn't. It's stayed stubbornly the same, or as I say, according to some indicators, it's gone down. But in that lovely book, Prosperity Without Growth, Tim Jackson, he's an interesting guy, actually. He's a professor, and he was on the government's Sustainable Development Commission until one of the very first acts of the greenest government ever was to scrap the Sustainable Development Commission, which was the very body that might have told it if it was having any success at all in becoming the greenest government ever. So obviously the government had a bit of an interest in getting rid of this thing just in case it said the wrong thing. But he wrote a report for that Sustainable Development Commission, and when he wrote it, the story goes that the government who was commissioned it essentially insisted that he put the question mark after it. So when he wrote it for the government, it was prosperity without growth, question mark, is it possible, or is this just ludicrous? And then when he published it himself by Earthscan as a book, out went the question mark. It was prosperity without growth. We are going to crack this. It's a difficult one. But he has a lovely analysis there of how so many forces around us are bombarding us through the advertising and elsewhere, basically telling us that if we don't consume the latest whatever it is, we're not sexy enough, we're not good enough, we're not beautiful enough. And he has this lovely phrase where he says, we've been persuaded to spend money we don't have on things that we don't need, to make impressions that don't last, on people we don't care about. And I think that's just kind of beautiful, and that's part of the stuff, I guess, that we're up against. So painting that picture, I'll just come back to that perhaps, painting that picture of what a greener lifestyle can be like, that it's not sackcloth and ashes and it's not shivering around a candle in a cave, because that's not very attractive. But what it is about, a more balanced quality of life and a better quality of life in some ways. And again, I pay tribute to New Economics Foundation, who I think are in the forefront of trying to map out what that would look like. Because if we have an economy that isn't based on generating more and more stuff, then that obviously raises big questions about, well, what jobs is everybody going to be doing if we're not, in fact, just making widgets that people buy and then we create pollution and so forth. And so they've got some really interesting modelling around, well, what would it look like if we genuinely had a 21-hour working week? How could we make that work? How would everything else need to work to make sure that what you earned in that 21 hours was enough to be able to, to enable you to live a good life in a way? And they're very good at talking about the things that really matter to people in their lives, which isn't necessarily just always being at the office or indeed at a factory line or whatever. There aren't many people as they get to the end of their life and look back on their lives think, oh my God, I wish I'd spent more time in the office. They're more likely to think, well, maybe there are other things I could have spent life doing, which might have been more fulfilling and so forth. And so I think the more we can look at other models of how, we could imagine a society where kids are playing in the streets again, where you've got more time for building relationships with your neighbours, with your friends, when you've got more, when you've got homes that are properly energy efficient, when you've got public transport which is properly affordable. I mean, there's so much once you start to paint what a greener society would look like that is actually very, very attractive, irrespective of the fact that we need to change because of peak oil or because of climate change. Then I think if we could get better at painting that picture, as Rob Hopkins does actually in that transition handbook, then I think that's much more likely to be a way of inspiring people to change, because I think that's what we need. We need inspiration. I was just going to end simply because I said at the beginning, social justice, environmental justice and peace, and peace does seem to be a very large part of the equation as well. And as you'll know more than most, peace is more than the absence of war. And if people spent as much time trying to work on conflict resolution and peace building and the tools that we need, if they spent as much time doing that as they do, manufacturing weapons of war, then the world would look very different. And it is very extraordinary, really, how even at a time of such austerity, because the government keeps telling us, the money can be found for more Trident spending. I mean, you may have heard an announcement just last week that another 3 or 4 billion has been found, even though they've put off the decision about whether or not to replace Trident nuclear weapons until after the next government. They're already spending billions now on the assumption that it will go ahead, and it'll be just like those aircraft carriers. You know, those aircraft carriers that we can't afford, but we couldn't afford to get out of the contract, so we're just going ahead with them anyway, even though we've got no weapons to put on them, which is quite a good thing, really, but it just does sort of point to the stupidity of spending money in that way. Well, the same thing's going to happen with Trident, and that's exactly what they're trying to do. And so we're broke, and yet we find 3 or 4 billion for Trident, and we're broke, and we find more money to keep the war going on in Afghanistan. You know, I just think we need to challenge this idea that there is no money. You know, first of all, there's plenty of money. It just depends who's got it and what they're using it for. And maybe sort of getting people to be a bit more literate about money in the first place, in the sense that, you know, the Bank of England has already put 325 billion into quantitative easing. I mean, you wouldn't feel it because, unfortunately, the private banks have kept hold of it. They haven't passed it on into the economy. But we can make money through credit creation. It's not, you know, if we wanted to use that money, that quantitative easing money, that credit, for more positive things, like a mass programme of insulating every single property in this country so that people weren't dying of fuel poverty, as they still are in the 21st century, even in a country, the 7th largest economy in the world, we still have people dying prematurely because they can't afford to keep their homes. 6.5 million people in fuel poverty. A programme of insulating all of those homes would, you know, do a huge amount in terms of getting their emissions down. It would do a huge amount in terms of jobs. It would stabilise the economy. So if we want to look at places we could be putting money instead of putting it into Trident, then there are so many ways we could be ticking the boxes of job creation, of environmental work as well, getting emissions down, and job creation and tackling fuel poverty. So I guess I would just end by saying that there's nothing inevitable about the way things are being done today, that it is all political priorities, and just as the government right now can prioritise weapons of destruction and, you know, getting rid of the 50p tax rate and, you know, all of the things that are actually making our world more dangerous and more unequal, you know, it's down to us if we want them to prioritise different things. There's nothing stopping them doing that. There's nothing stopping any of us doing that except for the political will, which I'm very much hoping that we'll find in this room and beyond.
I think probably a lot of people in this room welcomed the election of the first Green MP in British parliamentary history, and then perhaps got a bit despondent that you were a lone voice. Are there any other MPs that you find any common cause with, or are you a lone voice?
It is a bit lonely, but no, there are people that you can work with on a range of different issues, and actually that's really crucial, because obviously, as one MP, rare will be the occasion when I can swing a vote with my vote alone. But it is possible to find other MEPs to work with on different aspects of the whole agenda. And so, for example, you know, people like Jeremy Corbyn and the kind of the left of Labour who you'd imagine a no on issues around Trident, let's say, and nuclear weapons. But actually what's interesting is that you can make quite strange alliances too on some issues. So, for example, there's a Tory, a very right-wing Tory, Douglas Carswell, with whom I would have very little in common, except that he agreed with me that when we were being asked to vote in that referendum on the alternative vote, I was arguing very strongly and putting amendments down to say that there should be a genuinely proportional system on that ballot paper as well. So instead of just saying, do you want the status quo or something that's, you know, not much better, would you also like a genuinely proportional system? And so we worked together on that. And so I guess the good news is that on a lot of issues, it is possible to make alliances to try to push things forward. I think on the big issue of the growth dilemma, if you like, and that which to me is at the heart of so much of this, it's a lot harder to find allies on that. Zach Goldsmith maybe can be one, but those voices are very, very few, and that's a challenge.
Can I ask you about something that I read about the other day, and I thought today, that the idea of ecocide as an ally?
Yes.
And was she going to the European Court with that idea? I'm not quite clear about it, but I thought it was potentially an extraordinary, huge idea.
No, it's a brilliant idea. This is a barrister called Polly Higgins, and she's for the last few years has been working on this concept of ecocide, which she would add as just as we have genocide and another a range of other kind of war crimes, we don't have a crime that is about destroying the planet. And so she, with her legal background, has drawn up some really thorough and rigorous texts about how this law would work and how you would be able to put CEOs of oil companies on trial. And she's taken it both to the Rio summit, which has been going on just now, as you know, but also to the UN, and she's getting quite a lot of backing for it. So it's quite interesting, and she also has been running a couple of mock trials just to see what would happen, with jurors genuinely taken from the public, so not stacked to be people that already think that the environment's really important, but just ordinary people, if you like. And it raises quite a lot of questions. So, for example, if the punishment for damaging the planet is a monetary punishment, then in a sense those companies have so much money that frankly it doesn't cost them much. And so then they were looking at, well, you could look at prison sentences, but actually how about looking at reparations? In what way could those companies be using their resources to begin to make some kind of reparation? So I think it's an interesting lever, even if it doesn't go any further. But if it does go further as well and actually becomes a law, then I think that's great to have one more tool in our arsenal, if you like. That's not a very good analogy. One more useful mechanism in our peaceful box of tricks.
Following on from what you just said, I want to talk a bit about the collapse of the bee population. I read in The Independent that you challenged the government on the sale of the pesticide that is alleged to be causing the collapse of the bee population.
It's interesting. I mean, France, they have banned.
Yeah, they banned it outright. Why can't we?
Well, they'll definitely want some more research. It wants to wait till the whole bee population's dead, and then. I mean, it is maddening. It absolutely, and all of the kind of tools we thought we had around the precautionary principle and all of that, ought to be kicking in at this point, because there's a lot of evidence that this particular pesticide is at fault. And yet, even with that, DEFRA is still holding out because it's in the pockets of lots of the pesticide companies and so forth. But just because you mentioned the elephant in the room, and just in case anyone else was spotting elephants, I just wanted to put it on the record, from my perspective anyway, and other people might have different ways of putting it, but I just want to say that I do think that the Green Party is an anti-capitalist party. Just in case anyone's going to ask. Just in case.